Today, belling the Inequality Cat. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest posts covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. In the USA, the rich are getting richer, as Deutsche Bank Securities highlighted recently. The distribution of household wealth in America has become even more disproportionate over the past decade, with the richest 10% of US households representing 70% of all US wealth in 2018, compared with 60% in 1989, according to a recent study by researchers at Reserve Bank. And the share of wealth among the richest 1% increased to 32% from 23% over the same period. The Fed said that the increase in wealth among the top 10% is largely a result of that cohort obtaining a larger concentration of assets. The share of assets held by the top 10% of the wealth distribution rose from 55% to 64% since 1989, with asset shares increasing the most for the top 1% of households. These increases were mirrored by decreases for households in the 50th to 90th percentiles of the wealth distribution. And the GFC played a significant part in this growing gap, which resulted in the Federal Reserve stepping in to stem a massive ripple of losses through the global financial system as the housing market imploded back in 2007-2008. They lowered interest rates and did QE, which had the knock-on effect of pushing easy money into the hands of the already wealthy. This pushed home prices and stock prices steadily higher over the past decade. And in addition, there was a decline in home ownership, which usually represents the largest share of household wealth. The national home ownership rate in the US for the first quarter of 2019 was 64.2%, according to the US Census Bureau. That is below the historic average of 65.2%, which dates back to the 1960s. And stocks, of course, have enjoyed a massive increase since their crisis lows. But home ownership hasn't moved in step with that stock advance, and many individuals didn't participate in the stock market's rally after the crisis. And inequality has partly given rise to Democratic Socialist Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez's proposal to levy massive taxes on the super rich. A radical 70% tax on the wealthy has upset the punters. And billionaire Ray Dalio says capitalism is no longer working for most Americans, adding that the expanding wealth gap is creating a volatile environment with disturbing parallels to the economic and social upheavals of the 1930s. But no one in the US disagrees. Wealth distribution has become more uneven. So what about Australia? Well, as discussed in the conversation today, it appears that government bodies like the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Productivity Commission are playing down the rising inequality here. The article shows that the Bureau of Statistics did quite a bit of soul-searching before producing the bland and ultimately misleading press release headed "Inequality Stable" last month. That statement was data-free, no data to back up the claim, and journalists from the ABC, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age quickly discovered the statistics that it purported to summarise actually showed wealth inequality climbing. And in that vein, on Wednesday, in The Guardian, Paul Karp revealed the contents of documents released under Freedom of Information laws that shed light on the creation of the press release. An earlier draft had pointed to, quote, a significant increase in wealth inequality compared with 2011-12 and 2003-4. But the phrase significant increase didn't survive the editing process. And a reference to a measure of wealth inequality being at its peak since it was first comprehensively measured in 2003 to 2004, was also removed after a direction to, quote, focus on income over wealth. And another email noted that there had been, quote, a significant downward change in the wealth share of the bottom fifth of households, but added, I'm not sure that we want to draw attention to this though. Now, the Bureau responded to the Guardian article on Wednesday saying that it had not attempted to misrepresent the data and that it had prepared the press releases internally with no external influence. But it's not only the Bureau of Statistics that has found it difficult to draw attention to increasing wealth inequality. In August last year, the Productivity Commission released what it called a stocktake on the evidence on inequality, titled Rising Inequality with a question mark. It wasn't so much a stocktake of the evidence as a showcase of new specially assembled evidence that conflicted with a wider body of evidence that showed wealth inequality was increasing. The Commission's contribution presented the wealth shares for the top 10% of Australian households only. These came not from publicly available data, but from, quote, confidential unit record files made available to approved users by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. But the raw data tells a different story when put alongside four other well-established and widely published series. The striking feature is that every line except the Productivity Commission's shows inequality increasing since 2011. The data from both Credit Suisse, on which Oxfam bases its research, and the Evitt Foundation suggests that the top 10% now own more than half the nation's household wealth, and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development's 47.2% is just a little less. The Productivity Commission is an outlier in finding the top 10% own closer to 40%. It's finding that the share has been falling between 2014 and 2015-16 makes it even more of an outlier. And the ABS data showed the share of wealth held by the top 20% climbing, while the Commission's series showed the share held by the top 10% falling, implying that the share of the next top 10% must have been climbing quite a lot. This divergence strains credulity. There are no advantages in accumulating wealth that apply to households in the second top decile that do not apply equally to those in the top decile. Without an outside explanation, such as, for example, extra tax applying only to the top 10%, the result is just so improbable as to be impossible. And other data available from the Bureau at the same time show that the ratio of the wealth of households 10% from the top to the wealth of those 10% from the bottom had climbed, while at the same time the Commission found the wealth share of the top 10% overall had fallen. Unfortunately, the Commission gave pride of place to its own findings over and above more conventional findings and used a question mark in the title of its paper, Rising Inequality, to imply that it might not be. The truth is, wealth inequality is rising in Australia, something which our own household surveys show. And in the later post, I'll show you more of my data. But today, my point is, before any oncoming crisis, where the RBA cuts rates and does QE, just as the Fed did, we already have significant wealth inequality here in Australia. And we wonder if there is an attempt to suppress this truth now to make the path of following the US a little easier. One swallow may not make a summer, but when two of the main research bodies clearly bends the truth to hide the true level of inequality, we have a major issue. Yet one which no one wants to discuss. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.